The cleanest record is the one envy tries hardest to stain. In the cool hush of the palace chamber, the wax on the king's seal still smelled sharp, and Daniel stood there with the same calm face, while men around him whispered like they had already won. That made it so dangerous. Daniel had been lifted over rivals, and that kind of favor always exposes what people are carrying inside. The officials around him did not cheer. They watched. They measured. They started looking for a crack, a missed line, one careless slip they could call corruption. But the deeper they looked, the quieter the room got, because no flaw could be found in him. No hidden mess, no crooked deal, no dirty trail in the papers, no loose thread in the testimony. And that should have ended it. It should have. But envy is never satisfied with what is true. When the search came back empty, the men closest to the throne did what desperate schemers always do. They stopped hunting for facts and started building a trap. They knew Daniel kept his prayer life steady, no matter who was watching, no matter who was listening through the door. So they went after that. They pressed the king with a law that sounded formal, even loyal, the kind of thing that looks harmless until it is used against the faithful. They dressed the snare up like policy. Daniel heard the decree, and he did not flinch. That still stings his enemies. He did not scramble. He did not bargain. He did not hide his devotion to stay safe. He kept praying, as if the whispering in the hallway could not rewrite his soul. And that is where the real investigation began. Because once they caught him praying, they believed they had their proof. They did not know they were about to watch their own scheme turn back on them. If this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe and stay close, because Daniel's first test is where the trap starts to close. So they moved fast. The same men who had been circling his life like they owned the air came back with that smooth, practiced tone people use when they think the law has finally done their work for them. You hear the sandals on the stone floor, the dry scrape of the scroll, the little pause before they speak Daniel's name like it already belongs to the past. And that is the ugly part, chosen one. They did not need proof anymore. They had the order, they had the wording, they had the kind of paper that lets envy wear a clean face. But even then, the accusation felt thin because it was never about truth. It was about forcing a faithful man into a box he never agreed to enter. So the room had that strange feeling to it. Warm lamp oil in the air, sharp ink, nervous breathing, and under all of it, the weight of an unblemished record they could not shake. Daniel does not argue in the way they expect. He does not beg, he does not perform fear for their comfort. He stands there, calm as ever, and that calm is its own testimony. It says what words do not need to say. If you had looked longer, you would still find nothing. If you had searched deeper, you would still find no corruption. If you had come with 1,000 eyes, the result would not change. That is what enrages the schemers. Not just that he prayed, but that his prayer never came from panic. It came from habit, from devotion, from a life they never managed to penetrate. They wanted a man broken by pressure, but they found somebody built on a quieter authority. Now the officials have to carry their own trap into the royal chamber, bow their heads, and pretend this was all justice. But heaven is already working the angle they do not see. Because once the king hears what they have done, it starts to tremble. And Daniel's silence begins to sound a lot like a verdict waiting to be read. The king did hear it, and the room changed with him. One moment the officials were standing straight, holding their smooth words like a shield, and the next you could feel the weight of what they had done. The lamplight on the stone wall seemed to go dull. Even the footsteps outside the chamber sounded farther away. When a hidden scheme finally reaches daylight, it starts to look smaller than the men who built it. Daniel was still not the loudest thing in the room. That was the strange part. He did not need to raise his voice, because the record had already spoken for him. No fault could be found, and that silence around his name was louder than all their arguing. The officials kept their eyes on the king, but the king's face kept drifting back to the one man they had tried to corner. You could see it in him now, the line of regret, the sudden awareness that he had signed something he did not understand. And the accusers knew it. You can almost taste the fear under their confidence when power starts turning in the wrong direction. Their breathing gets shallow. Their hands start to move too much. They talk faster, then slower, then not at all. The snare turned on its makers, and they felt it before anyone said a word. This was no longer their neat little court story. It was becoming testimony, and they were on the wrong side of it. So the next moments mattered so much. The king was troubled, but trouble in a clean heart can become justice if it is allowed to move. He looked again at Daniel, and you could tell he wanted to undo the whole thing. But the law had been sealed. The room had been boxed in by the very decree the schemers had fed him. So now the only thing left was consequence, and heaven was already standing in that gap. Daniel did not plead. He did not perform panic for their comfort. He simply waited, as if he knew the louder verdict had not arrived yet. Then the king finally turned toward the guards and began to speak. So the order went out. The chamber that had been tight with whispers suddenly felt too open, like the walls themselves were listening. Guards moved in the cold torchlight, and the king's face had that stunned look of a man who sees the cost of his own signature too late. Daniel did not resist. He only stood there, steady and quiet, carrying that unbroken calm that made the whole scene feel wrong for the people who wanted a simpler ending. That is the part they never know how to explain. A guilty man claws at the door. A frightened man argues. But Daniel just looked the same. As they led him toward the outer court, the air changed. Stone underfoot, oil smoke in the hall, the rough breath of the night coming in from outside. The officials watched him like hunters who have finally cornered what they thought was prey. And still, something in their faces had begun to crack. Because the snare turned on its makers before the den even closed. The king followed far enough to see it, and that was worse for him than the decree itself. He could not undo what had been sealed, but he could not hide the look on his own face either. Daniel was lowered toward the opening, and the torchlight caught the edge of the stone like a hard, final line. No fault could be found in him, and now everybody in that court had to stand in front of that fact. Daniel kept his eyes level, just fixed, as if he had already placed the matter somewhere higher than the men around him could reach. And that made the officials uneasy in a way they had not planned for. They wanted a broken witness. They were getting a living testimony. Then the stone began to move, and the sound of it sliding into place landed like a question nobody wanted to answer. And just like that, the court lost its voice. The stone was in place, the seal was set, and the men behind the decree stood back with that hard, careful look people wear when they want to seem innocent after the damage is done. But you could feel it. The room was not settled. It was charged. The king turned away with the face of a man carrying a sentence he no longer wanted, and the schemers tried not to look too pleased, because even they could sense the judgment hanging over them now. That is what envy never understands. It thinks the moment the door shuts, the story is over. It thinks the den is the end, The paperwork is the end. The seal is the end. But heaven does not move by their timing. Daniel was still the quiet center of it all, still the one with a clean record, still the one whose life had already testified before a single guard touched the stone. The officials had wanted a scandal. They got a mirror. Now the mirror was turning back on them. You can see the king's mind working as he walks away from the entrance, hearing the scrape of the stone in his head like a warning. He knows the law is theirs, but the result is not. That is what starts to undo the whole room. A clean heart can survive a bad system, but a dirty motive has to keep explaining itself. So the accusers keep their faces still, keep their hands folded, keep acting like they are only watching procedure, while inside, they know the trap closed on them. Down below, Daniel is no longer a case file. He is a living witness in the dark. And that is where the real tension begins, because the court above has finished speaking, but the night has not. The king will not sleep. The men behind this cannot relax. And somewhere beyond that sealed stone, the breath of God is already moving toward the lion's den. Quietly, like a promise no one else can hear yet. That night stretched longer than any decree. Above the sealed stone, the palace would not settle. The king's table stayed untouched, the bread drying at the edges, the cups left where servants had set them down. No music eased the room. No comfort landed. He kept pacing, robe brushing the floor, mind circling the same bitter truth. A faithful man had been condemned, not because guilt was proven, but because prayer had been turned into evidence. And below all that human unrest, the man they tried to bury in silence was not abandoned. Chosen one, hear this closely. When God is guarding your name, the darkest place in the building can become the safest place for your soul. The same men who searched his life and found nothing had forced him into the lion's den, thinking isolation would finish what accusation began. But solitude had always been part of his strength. He already knew how to be alone without being empty. He already knew how to stay steady when no audience was clapping for him. So this moment matters so much. Daniel was not suddenly brave because danger came near. He had been faithful long before the stone moved. Long before those officials started comparing records and reading reports and trying to stain what heaven had already marked clean. A clean record does not begin in crisis. It is built in ordinary hours, in habits, in prayers, in choices nobody celebrates at the time. So now, while the accusers lie awake rehearsing their confidence, and the king wrestles with regret, the man in the pit remains the most settled person in the story. Do you see the reversal, beloved? The one with power has no rest. The ones with the scheme have no peace. But the man they accused has something they cannot manufacture: the quiet covering of God. The night kept moving. Torches burned low. Shadows stretched thin across the stone. Somewhere, beyond the reach of official seals and human orders, heaven had already answered the case. And dawn was coming with a question the king himself would have to ask. By the time the first light started to thin the dark, the whole palace was tired of pretending. The king had not slept. You could hear it in the way his voice dragged when he finally spoke, in the weight of each step as he came back toward the sealed place. The air smelled like ash from the lamps and cold stone from the courtyard. Daniel was still below, still waiting inside what the officials had turned into a public lesson. And still, no fault could be found in him. That is what makes this so sharp, chosen one. The people who built the trap could not sleep with it anymore. Their own faces had become part of the evidence. Every glance, every stiff reply, every fake calm breath, it all started to testify against them. They thought the den would swallow the problem, but it only made the whole thing louder. The snare turned on its makers before dawn ever came. And Daniel, that faithful man, was still untouched by the noise above him. The king came close enough to call out, and you can feel the room freeze in that moment. Not because the answer was uncertain, but because the answer mattered. This was the first real crack in the decree, the first place where human power had to speak to what it had tried to silence. The officials stood there too, listening hard, pretending they were only present for procedure. But the truth was already slipping out of their hands. You see it, don't you? A bad motive can draft a law, seal a stone, and hire guards. But it cannot control what happens after it has spoken. The record had already been written. The one they tried to shame had remained steady through the night. And now the morning itself was becoming a witness. So when the king called into the dark, the entire court leaned toward the answer. And nobody, not one of those men, could pretend they were in charge anymore. When the king called into the dark, the whole court held its breath. His voice went out rough at first, then steadier, carrying across the stone like a man trying to speak his way through regret. And then the answer came back from Daniel himself. Calm, clear, alive. That answer hit harder than any accusation the officials had brought the night before. You could feel it in the room. The king leaned forward. The schemers stopped looking at one another. For one quiet second, the den was a testimony waiting to be read aloud. Chosen one, this is where the pressure changes shape. The same people who thought they had sealed the end now have to stand there and hear the thing they feared most, that heaven did not miss the case. No fault could be found in him, and now the night had proved it in a way paper never could. They had hunted for corruption and found none. They had built a law and still could not break his covering. Daniel said the name of his God, and the king heard the difference between power and permission. That is what the upright always know. Not every closed door is final, and not every sealed place is silent. Some places are where heaven does its loudest work. The lion's den, meant to swallow a prayer, became the very place that protected it. And now the king has to decide what kind of ruler he really is, whether he will keep staring at the decree or look straight at the miracle standing in front of him. Because the answer from below changed everything above. The accusers cannot hide behind procedure now. Their faces are too exposed. Their confidence is too thin. It has started to tilt. And as the first light spreads across the stone, Daniel's voice is still the strongest thing in the room. So the king stepped closer, and the whole court moved with him. Morning had not warmed the stone yet. The air still held that night chill, the kind that makes every breath feel sharper than it should. The officials stood in a tight line, trying to look proper, trying to look faithful to the crown, but their faces had already begun to give them away. This was the part they never planned for, when the thing they sealed in secret comes back in daylight and starts naming them. The king called again, louder this time, and Daniel answered from below with the steady voice of a man whose prayer had outlasted their paperwork. That answer moved through the courtyard like a verdict. Beloved, you can hear the shift, can't you? The decree had looked final, but final is a dangerous word when God has not spoken yet. No fault could be found in him, and now the morning itself was backing that up. The king's face changed. You could see relief fighting with shame, and shame losing ground fast. He had been used, and now he knew it. The men who pushed him into this were still trying to keep their hands folded, still trying to stand there like this was all normal order. But the snare turned on its makers, and the silence around them started to feel heavier than any chain. One answer from the dark had done what all their accusations could not. Then the guards moved toward the stone. That is when the whole court held still again. The rough scrape of rock, the low grunt of men shifting weight, the smell of dust and lamp oil, cold and stale in the morning air. Daniel had spent the night in what they meant as a final place, but now the final place was looking very different. No victory yet, not fully, but no longer theirs, and that alone was enough to make the schemers nervous. Because once the covering comes off, everybody sees who kept the clean hands and who did not. The king leaned in, the guards braced, and the stone began to give, revealing whatever the night had left behind. As the stone shifted, the first thing the court received was stillness. Dust lifted into the cold morning air. The guards strained against the weight, sandals scraping, breath turning white in the dawn. And there he was, not broken, not scattered, not marked by the sentence that was supposed to finish him. Daniel stood in that opened place with the calm of a man whose case had already been heard somewhere higher. That sight hit everybody at once, but not in the same way. The king looked like a man being released from a pressure he could no longer carry. The officials looked like men trying to keep their faces from confessing. And the reason was plain chosen one. An unblemished record had just come out of the pit alive. All the whispers, all the checking, all the legal language, all the smug certainty from the night before, none of it could stand next to what they were seeing with their own eyes. This is the part people miss when they talk about deliverance. Heaven does not only answer with rescue. Sometimes heaven answers with evidence. Daniel was not merely heard from below. He was brought up where every witness could look. The king did not have to rely on rumor now. The court did not have to guess. The same man they had searched for flaws was being examined again in public daylight, and the result had not changed. No fault could be found in him before the den, and no harm could be found on him after it. Do you feel the force of that, beloved? The accusation failed on paper first, then failed in the dark, and now it was failing in public. The officials had tried to use a decree to do what investigation never could. But when God decides to answer, he answers across every level: private conscience, public witness, and visible outcome. That is why the men standing nearby suddenly seemed smaller than they had the day before. Their authority had not vanished, but their credibility had. The king stepped forward, eyes fixed on the man being lifted out, and the court knew this moment was no longer about survival alone. It was about what would happen to the ones who had engineered the whole thing. The king did not hesitate for long after that. Once the man was brought up, the mourning turned into an inspection. Hands reached to steady him, eyes searched him, and every witness standing near had to deal with the same impossible fact. The man they had marked for ruin came out whole. No sign of panic on him. No sign that the night had broken his spirit. It was as if the court had opened a sealed file and found heaven's answer already written inside. Chosen one. This is what your enemies never account for. They imagine accusation as the final document. They think once they stamp your name with a charge, the matter is settled. But God knows how to turn a public setup into a public audit. He knows how to bring you back into the light, and let the same eyes that searched for damage become witnesses to preservation. That morning, an unblemished record did not stay hidden in memory. It stood breathing in front of them, and the king saw it. You can feel the shift in him now, relief giving way to anger waking up, clear anger, the kind that comes when a ruler realizes he was handled, steered, used by men who came wearing the language of order while serving something rotten underneath. He had been drawn into a false case against a faithful servant, and the proof was standing right there in front of him. The officials, though, they were suddenly very still. That practiced confidence from earlier had nowhere to go, because this was no longer about whether the decree had been legal. It was about whether the men behind it had been clean. That is where heaven presses hardest, beloved, not only on outcomes, but on motive. The men who investigated him had found nothing. Then they tried policy. Then they tried the den. And now all three had testified against them at once. The snare turned on its makers, slowly at first, then all at once, like a door giving way under weight. The king looked from the rescued man to the line of officials who had pushed the accusation, and when he opened his mouth again, the whole court understood that the next words would not sound anything like the last decree. What came next was not celebration. It was accounting. The king did not let the moment drift. The rescued man was standing in the light, but the court was still full of men who built a lie and called it order. That is where the real weight landed. Because once Daniel was seen whole, the focus moved straight to the hands that had pushed him toward the lion's den in the first place. The room, which had smelled like dust and lamp smoke only a few minutes before, now felt tense and close, like every breath had to pass through the same narrow truth. Beloved, this is the part envy never expects. It can survive suspicion. It can even survive delay, but it cannot survive a clean witness. When the record is opened and the facts stand up on their own, the hidden motive starts showing through the paper. No fault could be found in Daniel. No harm could be found after the night. So what exactly was left? Only the people who had tried to turn a faithful man into a problem. Daniel stood quiet through all of it. He did not need to defend himself again. He had already done that by living clean, by praying steady, by staying the same when the pressure changed. That kind of consistency becomes its own testimony. It tells the truth before the mouth ever opens. Now the king was not looking at a case against Daniel. He was looking at the evidence against the men who had built the case. You can feel the shift, can't you? The accusers are still there, still breathing, still trying to wear official faces. But the room has changed sides. The snare turned on its makers. And the shock of that is not loud. It is cold. It is the moment when a bad plot realizes it has become the thing under review. The king's next words did not come soft. They came like a door opening on judgment, and the men who counted on silence were about to hear their own names spoken in the daylight. And when the king spoke, the air in that court changed again. It was the voice of a ruler who had finally seen the whole scheme for what it was. He looked at the rescued servant, then at the officials who had pressed the charge, and in that pause, you could hear their confidence thinning out. A moment earlier, they had been hiding behind procedure. Now, procedure was looking straight back at them. Chosen one, this is how heaven unmasks a setup, sometimes without noise, sometimes later than the trap is laid. But when truth stands up in plain sight, every false motive starts losing its cover. The men who searched his life had found no corruption. They could not stain the record, so they twisted the law. They could not break the man, so they exposed themselves. That is the bitter miracle of envy. It always thinks it is prosecuting you, when in the end, it is submitting evidence against itself. Daniel did not rush into the center of that moment. he stayed still. He did not need to add a speech to what had been proven. The king's eyes had seen enough. The court had seen enough. The morning had seen enough. And the same officials who once stood close to power now looked like men standing too near a fire they had built with their own hands. The king began to ask questions no one in that line wanted to answer. About motive this time, not prayer or the decree. About why a faithful servant with a clean history had been singled out. About why men who claimed loyalty had worked so hard to condemn the one person whose conduct had never given them a case. You can almost feel the room tightening with every word. Sandaled feet shifting on stone, dry mouths, hands clasped too hard, the smell of old dust and oil hanging there while heaven pressed on conscience. Beloved, this is the turning point people rarely talk about. Deliverance is one thing, exposure is another. The rescue had already happened. Now, the hidden engine behind the attack was being dragged into the light. And the king was not finished speaking. He was about to answer their decree with one of his own. So the king answered the false decree with a true one. His voice carried across the court with a different weight now, the weight of a man who had watched heaven overrule what envy had drafted. The same stone floor, the same guards, the same officials standing there in stiff silence, but the authority in the room had shifted. Daniel was no longer framed as a problem to be managed. He stood there as living evidence that the God he served was not a private comfort, but a public reality. Beloved, that is how divine vindication works. First, it rescues you. Then, it rewrites the atmosphere around your name. The men who tried to make prayer look suspicious had to listen while the king honored the God who answered that prayer. The ones who had leaned on policy now had to stand under proclamation. And the servant they tried to reduce to a charge had become the clearest witness in the kingdom without even arguing for himself. The court heard it all. It was a reversal in broad daylight. The ruler spoke of the living God, of deliverance, of a power greater than his own seal. You could almost feel the officials shrinking inside their robes. Their plot had failed. It had been overturned in the one place they most wanted control, the public record. And through all of it, Daniel stayed steady. That matters, chosen one. He did not become proud because he was vindicated. He did not start swinging his survival around like a weapon. He remained what he had been before the investigation, before the decree, before the den. Faithful, measured, covered. That kind of steadiness is what makes the testimony land so hard. Because when a person stays whole through both accusation and rescue, everybody watching has to admit the strength did not come from ego. The king's declaration spread beyond that courtyard, beyond the sealed stone, beyond the officials who had tried to contain the story. But the matter was not finished yet. A public word had gone out, and the men who built the trap still had to face what their own scheme had set in motion. But the deepest part of the vindication was still unfolding. A decree had changed. Daniel did not disappear after the crisis. The officials who envied him had built their whole case on one quiet fantasy: that one night, one charge, one engineered fall would be enough to move him out of the way for good. That is how envious people think, beloved. They do not just want to wound your name. They want to interrupt your future. And yet here he was, still standing, still trusted, still useful. That detail matters more than many people realize. Rescue is powerful, yes, but sustained favor after attack, that is a different kind of judgment. It tells everybody watching that the setup did not merely fail in the moment, it failed in its purpose. The point of the scheme had been removal. The point of the investigation had been disqualification. The point of the decree had been to freeze his rise. But when the dust settled, the same man was not only alive, he remained weighty in the kingdom. You can almost feel what that would do to the hearts of those who plotted against him. Because once the morning passed, once the king's words spread, once the court stopped whispering and started remembering, the truth became impossible to bury. The one they had searched most intensely was the one with the cleanest standing. The one they pushed toward shame came back with greater honor. The one they tried to isolate became the reference point for faithfulness in the room. That is what spiritual reversal looks like, chosen one. Continuance. Open doors that stay open after they are done speaking. Daniel carried something they could not outmaneuver. Credibility formed over time, favor that outlived sabotage, and a private life strong enough to survive public scrutiny. And that pattern did not stop with a single ruler or a single morning. The same servant kept rising, even as thrones changed hands and seasons shifted. While the men who tried to trap him faded into the background of their own failed design, his usefulness remained, his steadiness remained, his witness remained. Which raises the question the next part of this story has been building toward all along. What was it in Daniel's inner life that made him so difficult to remove? That question leads straight into the heart of the matter. What made him so hard to remove was not politics. It was not charm. It was not some secret alliance hidden in the corners of the court. It was the life he had built when nobody was watching. Daniel had already learned how to live apart without becoming bitter, how to stay quiet without becoming weak, how to pray without needing an audience. And that, beloved, is what your enemies misread most often. They call your distance pride. They call your boundaries coldness. They call your silence emptiness. Until the day those very things keep you from being tangled in their mess. That was true for him long before the decree. He was not mixed up in corrupt dealings. He was not feeding gossip circles. He was not chasing every invitation, every alliance, every little scramble for approval. So when the investigators went looking, they found no loose trail to follow. When the accusation came, there was no divided life to expose. And when the crisis hit, solitude did not frighten him, because he had already made peace with being alone in the right way. Chosen one, this is divine strategy hidden inside ordinary discipline. People think power looks loud. They think protection looks dramatic. But sometimes protection looks like a clean routine, a guarded mouth, a life simple enough that hostile eyes grow frustrated trying to misread it. Daniel's strength in the court was built in private. His calm in the den was built in private. His credibility under kings was built in private. The men around him tried to create a public collapse, but they were up against habits formed in secret with God. So the attack kept failing at every layer. The investigation failed because his conduct was sound. The decree failed because his devotion was steady. The den failed because heaven met him there. And the aftermath failed to push him out because his usefulness did not come from the favor of one moment, but from a rooted life. So now you can see the whole pattern opening up. The trap was allowed, yes, but it was also forced to reveal what had been hidden in plain sight all along. And in the final turn of this story, that pattern becomes a message not just about Daniel, but about you. And that is where his story stops being distant history and starts reading your mail. Because what held him up was not only a miracle in one terrible night, it was the pattern of a life already audited by pressure. The investigators looked, the rivals watched, the decree tested, the den proved. At every layer, the same answer came back. The man was the same in private as he was in public. And beloved, so the attack could not finish its work. It had nothing solid to hold on to. You need to hear this, chosen one. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is evidence still being gathered. Solitude is not always rejection. Sometimes it is insulation. A simple life is not always small. Sometimes it is armored. That is what his story reveals so clearly. The habits that looked plain from the outside were the very things heaven used as a witness when the accusation came. Think about it. If his life had been scattered, the investigators would have found openings. If his devotion had been performative, the decree would have shaken him. If his peace had depended on public approval, the den would have broken him. But none of that happened. The same order showed up every time. The same rootedness, the same steady inner world. So the trap exposed itself. It ran into a man whose private life was prepared for public testing. And that is where many people miss the real lesson. They focus only on the rescue, but the rescue was not floating by itself. It rested on years of hidden choices, guarded words, clean hands, consistent prayer. A willingness to be misunderstood rather than contaminated. Daniel did not become covered in the crisis. The crisis revealed the covering that was already there. So if you have been wondering why God has had you living quieter than others, why certain circles never fit, why your spirit would not let you join what looked popular, maybe it was never punishment. Maybe it was preparation. Maybe what looked like distance was actually protection being built into your story before the court ever assembled. And in this final stretch, that truth is going to land where it belongs, right on your life. The last turn was quiet, but it was still power. A new morning came over the palace, with pale light on the stone steps, and Daniel was already back at his work, not in fear or hiding. The old scrolls were stacked beside him, the ink still dark in the corner of the page, and the room smelled like wax, dust, and cold metal from the lampstand. Then the messenger arrived, with a fresh summons from the next throne, and the same name moved through the hall again. Daniel, as the man they still needed. Beloved, that is the part that seals this story in your spirit. The scheme did not just fail to end him, it failed to outlast him. The lion's den did not become his story's grave. It became one more place where no fault could be found. And the people who tried to bury his voice had to watch him keep walking, keep serving, keep rising, while their own names slipped back into the background where envy belongs. Here is the wisdom in the image. A lamp that keeps burning through a sealed night will still be warm when morning opens the door. That is what Daniel left behind in that court. Just the proof of a life that stayed lit when the room went dark. The seals were broken, the papers were changed, the palace had new hands on the throne. But the same quiet faith kept showing up at the desk, kept standing in the doorway, kept answering when called. By the time the courtyard emptied, only the lamp oil and a few footprints remained on the stone. If this story gave you peace, strength, or confirmation, subscribe and stay with this community. And drop a comment so we know you were here.